Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Patrícia Silva. She is an assistant professor at the University of Aveiro and a researcher at the Governance, Competitiveness and Public Policies Research Center of the University of Aveiro. And today we're going to talk about a book she is the editor of, together with Pedro Magalhães and Nuno Monteiro, that is Portugal in the 21st century. So, Dr. Patrícia, welcome to the show. It's a huge pleasure to have you.
Thank you for having me here today.
So, I mean, this is a very interesting book. I mean, in my particular case, it's even more interesting because I'm also Portuguese, as you are. So, but what are the goals of this book? Why write a book about Portugal in the 21st century?
Well, so the idea for this edited book came from a series of conversations that Nuno Monteiro had with the Luso-American Development Foundation. At the moment, Nuno, he was working at a university in the US, and he thought that we needed a reference book that would allow academics to deal with Portugal and what the changes that happened during the 21st century in the Portuguese case. But he also wanted to have a book that would be interesting for the entire public, for the ones that are interested in knowing a little bit more about Portugal. So the book was targeted at these two audiences, I'd say, one academic and the one that would allow the general public to be involved in these discussions about the Portuguese case. Nuno began developing this project with the authors, the specific authors of each of the chapters that we will discuss during this interview. Unfortunately, Nuno passed away before he managed to complete this job, and so the flood asked me and Pedro Magalhães to continue the project. So the idea is basically the idea of dealing with a country that has a very interesting story, and especially the fact that it had 4 decades of a dictatorship and that had enduring effects. While we noticed that there was a major transformation, and we can see that obviously in the first years after the transition to democracy, but then we also find that the specificities of the transition process, and also the fact that we have enduring aspects that allow us to now understand a little bit of what is happening in terms of our identity, in terms of our culture, in terms of how we relate to the European Union and how relevant the European Union is, also in terms of the party system. So we have a lot of specificities from these decades of dictatorship that were somehow translated into different arenas. And Nuno had this interest in dealing with these, what he thought would be a remarkable country with a remarkable history. So, what we asked the authors of every chapter was to think about their specific arena, either the economy or the society, political system, the arts, literature. We asked them to think about how we had a spectacular economic development, how the country has transformed itself from a social perspective. And we wanted to especially look into how these transformations play out today, currently during this new millennium, especially. Sorry.
Mm-hmm. So before we talk about Portugal in the 21st century, I think it would be important to cover some historic ground here, because this year marks the 51st anniversary of the fall of the military dictatorship here in Portugal. And I mean, there was a democratization process after that. What do you think were some of the main changes that occurred with the transition from a dictatorship to a social democracy?
Well, I think this is such a broad question because there are hundreds of articles that have been published trying to deal with these main changes. Well, you know that the journey began with this carnation revolution that some authors even say that it marked the beginning of the third wave of democratization in the world. So I want to stress that because Portugal did this process of transition to a democracy without having a model that the country could aim for. So that necessarily generated a little bit of conflict and a little bit of indecisiveness as to where we should go after this peaceful military coup. But we did have this peaceful military coup that, you know, that was led by the armed forces movement, and it marked the end of one of the biggest dictatorship that occurred at the moment with more than 48 years, and with a large period where we have strict censorship, political repression, no political freedoms. So this revolution was also largely fueled by these discontent of citizens, particularly because of the ongoing colonial wars that was draining the resources and also the morale in Portugal. So there was this the public desire and also this desire among the members of the armed forces that wanted to overthrow the dictatorship and build a new democratic society. So yes, we did experience a very significant transformation with first elections where we had citizens participating in a competitive scenario. That's because we did have elections during the dictatorship, but those were not necessarily competitive, and that's a huge difference. So we also had the process of preparing, the very complex process of preparing this new constitution with civil rights, political freedom, with social rights that were essential for the democracy. And then we had this very, very rapid decolonization of the Portuguese territories in Africa, and that how fast it was also an aspect of contention within the armed forces that eventually generated this convulsionary period right after 74. And then the regime, political parties that were formed at the moment, especially the Social Democratic Party and the Socialist Party that was formerly a little before 74. But and was formed not necessarily in the country, but in exile. But they were trying to find the space for these political parties. And one of the ways that they understood that the new democratic regime would be able to gain grounds was through the expansion of rights and welfare. That's why we have this major conquest in Portugal, which is the national health system. The idea that we needed to improve education, healthcare, social services, reducing inequalities, and improve the quality of life of citizens. And that was that is certainly an arena where we made huge progresses during the first decades of the democracy. Obviously, we had political instability. We did have a lot of political instability, especially because there was contention as to which type of regime we would have. And because we had the communists wishing a different type of democracy, and then we had the Socialist Party and the Social Democratic Party that wanted a more pro-Western type of democracy, a liberal democracy. And so we had also these two political parties, these two poles that were aiming for different goals. So major transformations, but with a very convulsionary journey.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to the democratization process, I mean, of course, it was a process because the transition from a dictatorship to a democracy doesn't occur overnight. How long was it? Just for people to have an idea of how these things play out.
Well, it is not easy to establish a specific date, but I would say that the first 2 years were fundamental to decide that we wanted to have what type of a democracy we wanted. It was also the first 2 years that we decided that, well, the goal would be to democratize the country, also deal with the colonies and decolonize. But it wasn't definitely a smooth and negotiated process like the one that we saw, for example, in Spain, where the political elites actually negotiated. There were agreements between the old regime and the opposition. So what we had in Portugal was this radical break, and that was also what generated this intense period with political and social contention, I'd say. So, but I would say that we had these 2 first years where, you know, we had the hot summer of '74 when we had these tensions that even generated violent clashes, and then also November 25 and '75. So we did have this period, I would say, of about 2 years from the carnation to the time where we actually were able to adopt a new constitution and then managed to have elections in that would definitely establish this as a country that was democratizing. Obviously, we say that we have there's this transition period, and then there's the period where we say that, well, we now have a consolidated democracy, and that these are 2 different processes, 2 different periods. And what we consider is that it is generally assumed that we consider Portugal as a consolidated democracy from the moment when Cavaco Silva managed his first majority as a government, and then we had stable patterns of party interaction, stable patterns of government formation, and that allows us also to think that, well, we are now entering a stage where we are now entering the stage where we have fully a democracy. It's not so. I just wanted to make sure that we make these 2 periods as distinct. One thing is the transition to, and the other is to consolidate it as a democracy.
Half a century later, do you see that there's been a legacy to the dictatorship in any way? And if so, in what ways does it manifest? Is it politically? Is it in terms of the population's mentality, particularly the older people who lived through the dictatorship? What do you think about it?
Well, there are so many. There are so many of these legacies that we can see. One of them is obviously politically. First one is the idea of what kind of parties do we have now, and that is a lot explained by the process of the transition, because, you know, the political parties actually emerged at the period when they didn't have necessarily time to mobilize the electorate, and especially the Socialist Party and the Social Democratic Party, when they emerged, they had a view of what kind of a democracy they wanted. And then we had a communist that had a stronger mobilization, I would say. But these new political parties that were formed, they actually entered government a few days after they were formally established. So what this generated political parties that are what we call internally mobilized. It means that they were able to establish their organizations taking stock of the resources that they gained from state. So we managed to have these political parties that somehow are dependent on the state, and that has, to some extent, discouraged the development of strong, independent party structures. Another thing that we notice is how is clientelism, the idea that that is quite. There are a lot of research that claims that this is quite pervasive in the Portuguese case, because parties actually were able to use public administration to distribute positions to their followers. It was an easy way of, guaranteeing support for the political party. So what they did, they took stock of those resources that they had access to. And to some extent, that generated a path where clientelism has been pervasive, and it becomes increasingly more difficult for political parties to get rid of this. So while political parties are central, they do have this dependency on the state. And then we also notice that in terms of the economy, Susana Peralta also to some extent deals with that, the idea that we had, this massive nationalization of industries. We had one of the biggest public sector businesses at the public business sector at the moment. And that to some extent also generated a little bit of, a burden, an enormous burden in terms of the public sector, and also the difficulties in dealing with these enormous structures. We also deal with this nationalized economy that was characterized by poor productivity deficits, with political interference as well. And to some extent, there are some inefficiencies here that endured. And obviously, there were at the moment this also connecting to the size of the public civil service, because of the purges, because Portugal did had extensive purges of political and administrative personnel from the new state, because of this transition through ruptura, because we didn't have a pact, as I mentioned before. So what we had was a public administration that was destructured. So we didn't have necessarily experienced staff. It created a lot of inefficiencies in governance, and that also generated this difficult relationship also with public administration. And finally, I think one of the most relevant, and we keep talking about this, is that there was an intense dispute between the Socialist Party and the Communist Party during the transition period. And because it basically deals with how the two different parties understood political pluralism and the different types of democracy that these two parties wanted. So that generated a divide at the left. So we would expect this divide to occur between the left and the right. What we had in the Portuguese case was this divide between political parties and the left, and that wall that was built between the Socialist Party and the Communist Party was actually endured, and it generally led to the exclusion of the Communist Party from every government formation until now, until obviously 2015, as you know, when there was this collaboration between left-wing parties that was somehow innovative, because we wouldn't expect that given this historical background. But I would say that also this is probably one of the major aspects of these legacies of the dictatorship.
So one more major event in our history that I would like to ask you about before we get actually into the 21st century. Let's talk a little bit about Portugal's accession to the European Union in the 1980s. What does it represent historically, and what would you say are the main impacts it had in terms of at the level of politics, economics, and also at a social level?
Well, this is again a question that would generate hours of conversation, because as we had this transition period, and as things were going, we have reasons to believe that the country would make its way through a democracy. But having the European Union as a supporter of a democracy was definitely relevant to establish and to consolidate Portugal as a democracy. Because it was, at the moment, we had two visions for Portugal. We either would look for African colonies, or we would align with Western democracies and try to modernize the country looking at the European Union. And it became very clear in the 70s, in mid-70s, when Mário Soares decided that he would join the then European Economic Community, and then became the European Union. And what he thought that was a way to secure democracy, to enjoy the opportunity of the funds, especially to modernize the economy that was so relevant to provide citizens with the gains of being a democracy and with the gains of being part of this new world of the European Union. So when he applied for membership, for EU membership in 77, it became definitely a priority for every government. We do not find major differences between our main political parties, the Socialist Party or the Social Democratic Party. They were basically aligned with this idea that we needed the European Union to modernize the country. And the European Union also had high standards in terms of what they expected of a democracy. It was also the European Union that that created, to some extent, the idea that we could not have the armed forces with such a relevant role of the armed forces within our government, and also the pressure towards modernizing also the economy. In terms of, the story, because the country gained a lot from being part of this club, of the European club, because of the funds, which helped modernize the structures, which were strongly used to reduce inequalities at the regional level, that was used to improve education and healthcare. It also, politically, it helped solidify the consensus among political parties and also among citizens about the importance of European integration. I mean, even now we see these Eurobarometers that largely express this idea that citizens still think that being part of the European Union is a good thing. They have a good image of the European Union, and that definitely is relevant. But now, obviously, one of the things that we come across is this idea that obviously Portugal in the 21st century deals with this additional difficulty at this moment, because we are now we have been making this progress of enlarging the European Union. And if Portugal had this privileged position, even when we consider there as a member that receives a lot of EU funds. But there was a shift, because obviously as we are enlarging, some of the recipients are other countries, not necessarily Portugal. And so this shift in terms of the allocation of funds, and also this perception that Portugal is at the periphery of the European Union, that might have generated a little of disillusionment within Portugal about the gains of the European Union. But I think that overall, it was definitely a strategic decision that was able to consolidate the democracy and help it go through, navigate this political, economic, and social matters that were relevant to secure democracy.
So since we've been part of the European Union for more than 30 years now, almost 40, how has Portugal fared in comparison to other members of the European Union for the first 2 decades of the 21st century?
Well, I think that one of the things that has to be highlighted here is that Portugal has, during the 21st century, has had one of the most turbulent chapters in our recent history, which is the financial crisis and how Portugal dealt with this financial crisis. Obviously, Portugal had structural weaknesses in terms of the economy, in terms of public debt, and we did require this financial bailout, the Troika package that came with was fundamental for Portuguese restructuring, rethinking about what kind of state we wanted, but it came with very strict conditions, I would say. But what was relevant at this time was that Portugal was actually able to implement a lot of these measures, cuts in public services, and to some extent, some of them were not necessarily, although the crisis, this financial crisis has gone a couple of years ago, fact is that we may not have been able to go to reach a standard where we wanted to be in terms of public services. We also had this this huge program that was difficult to implement, but in the end, what was interesting in the Portuguese case is this idea that Portugal was able to regain credibility. It was actually considered a good student within the European Union. And we saw that when we saw, for example, Mário Centeno being considered to become the president of the Eurogroup. It was to some extent also understood as the testament of how the country would have a good reputation in Europe, and also how the country would be considered as a model for other countries that were struggling, I'd say. So while Portugal has made it through, I think that it has made huge progress, but obviously we will talk about it, I guess, later, because the high levels of public debt are still there, and many of the cuts that were made were in terms of public investment. We have left essential services like healthcare and education underfunded, and that to some extent also portrays this image as Portugal being, while efficient, it may not be sufficiently efficient in terms of the allocation of resources.
You mentioned briefly there the 2008 economic crisis. How would you characterize our response to it? And we are now in 2025. Do you think we are still being affected by it in some way?
Well, my question would be, yes, we are still affected by the crisis in several ways. I mean, while obviously one of the things definitely in terms of public discourse, we did not have governments so focused on the idea that we need to reduce the budget deficits and stabilize the economy. This became as a lasting scar of this 2008 crisis, 2008, 15, 14, I guess. So we had this, while we thought that we only had some political parties that were dealing with and were considering this as a priority, we now have the two main parties considering both are considering it as a priority. And the results are out there. So we saw the Socialist Party made a huge progress in this regard, but all the other parties that are coming are still dealing with this need to keep our budget deficit stable and obviously reduce this deficit. But where I think that we have the major impact is most definitely in terms of the public services. And one of the chapters of this book clearly demonstrates that, we have particularly in the healthcare and education, they were really strongly strained during the crisis. And there are ongoing issues there in terms of personnel, in terms of resources that are allocated, and these are services that are fundamental to reduce inequalities in the Portuguese case that are still out there, and that feed populism. So these inequalities to some extent feed populism, and the way to lower them is through education and healthcare, access to these public services, and they are under severe stress. And that is definitely one of the memories of the crisis that continues, and that that all of the countries have to deal with.
In the book, you also take the time to talk a little bit about the formation of a Portuguese national identity. How did it occur? I mean, how did it develop over time, and which factors contributed to it?
Well, that's one of the things that the José Manuel Sobral does in this chapter. He deals with this idea that Portuguese identity was built as a mixture of territory, of the boundaries, of the limits, geographical limits, but also a little bit of culture, and this idea that the culture and also mostly linguistic issues, how we do not have diversity in terms of language. And also there's obviously a little bit of history in that, that José Manuel Sobral goes through this idea that we have this Afonso Henriques that managed to put Portugal on the map, and how he declared to be a prince of Portugal, and the recognition of Portugal through the Treaty of Samora. So there's also a little bit of history here that obviously José Manuel Sobral does it a lot more than I'm probably doing here. It does explain this in depth. But one of the things that I found so much interesting in his chapter is how he also deals with how the identity was built because of the symbolic issue. And one of the things that he mentions in his chapter was what he calls the miracle of Auric, when he said that that miracle says that Christ actually appeared to Afonso Henriques before a battle, and that Christ was actually blessing his mission. So to some extent, this also tied Portugal to this identity, not only in terms of language, in terms of the territory, but also how close Portugal would be in terms of Christianity, and the idea that we are, to some extent, a chosen people. So by the 14th century, we already had this national consciousness that was trying to spread, and we had these three pillars in terms of language, the territory, and also this idea of how there was some linkage to this Christianity that also helped build the nation as we know it today.
And how would you characterize the welfare state in Portugal? What are its main features, and how does it compare to other European nations?
Well, that's Rui Branco and Pedro Silva. They wrote this chapter on one of the major aspects that I think distinguishes the Portuguese case, which is the welfare state and how relevant the welfare state is for Portugal. And what I think that one of the main takeouts of this of their chapter is that it is indeed an aspect that faces significant challenges because of the what they call this market dualization, that you have protection for the ones that are working and are integrated in the labor market, and the ones that are only temporary workers. And you do have these two types of support for citizens. So that's a specific aspect of our welfare system that puts some that is also constraining. Then we have this demographic pressures that are ongoing in the Portuguese case. And it's interesting that they bring that to their chapter, because it is one of the issues that politically it has to be on the agenda, how the demography is putting pressure on the welfare state, and we should deal with that as well. And obviously, as we mentioned before, the limited expenditure. But I think that we have a welfare system that is, to some extent, unique. It aims to provide universal access to healthcare, obviously funded through our general taxation, but it has been a vital institution. It was a vital institution during the democratization process, and it still is vital, even if it is dealing with these difficulties, particularly related to the financial sustainability of the social security, of this welfare. And one of the things that they deal with is this idea that the way that we index pensions to life expectancy, also how early retirement has been penalized. It has reduced the generosity of our social security systems. And also, obviously, during the financial crisis that we have just dealt with, we also dealt with cuts, freezes, reduced investment in this arena. So it not only generates this debate on the relevance of the welfare state, but also the impact of the welfare state in terms of how pivotal it can be to reduce inequalities. Obviously, now we are dealing with this. What we currently have is a social security system that has to deal with poverty, with social exclusion. A lot has been done in terms of, what they deal with in the chapter is that how Portugal ensured this minimum income. That was a huge step to combat poverty. But again, there are a set of rules that citizens now have to address if they want to have access to these issues. And what the chapter concludes is that while we do have a welfare state that shares some similarities with other countries like Spain or Greece, we are also aiming at having social security services that we would be able to compare with the northern European countries like Sweden or Denmark. These are the ones that we keep comparing with, because of the idea that Portugal welfare state is slightly less comprehensive than the ones that we find in these countries. So we do have a significant level of social expenditure. That's what the chapter concludes, but it's still below what we find in these more extensive welfare systems.
I would like to ask you now just a few questions about our political system. So what would you say characterizes Portugal's political system when it comes to the electoral system and to party representation?
Well, Carlos Jalali, he's the one that dives into Portuguese political system, and what he concludes, the chapter that he wrote is actually about how fascinating we have this mixture of structures in the Portuguese case, and he unpacks this idea that we have a semi-presidential representative democracy, which means that we have a president and the prime minister. But the kicker here is that the president is directly elected by the people. It's not like, for example, in Germany, where the president comes from parliament. So they are both the president and the government are directly elected by citizens. As you know, in 2024, we have legislative elections, and then we will have presidential elections. So these are to representative institutions that are both elected by citizens. But a funny part here is that while we have a president that has veto powers, the fact is that the government is actually accountable to Parliament. So it is up to Parliament mostly to ensure that a government stays in power. The electoral system, as you asked, is also, it has been central also. It's also one of those legacies that we came from the transition period, because the electoral system, as we have a closed list proportional representation system. What does this mean? Well, it just means that we do not select individual candidates. I mean, citizens vote for political parties, and it is up to the party to decide the order of the candidate. It's up to the party to decide the order of the candidates. So the seats are distributed according to how citizens actually vote, the percentage of votes that each party gets, using this ONT formula. And the formula somehow benefits the two main political parties, the Socialist Party and the Social Democratic Party. There's also, we do not have an electoral threshold. I mean, electoral thresholds are the limits. For example, Germany again has these electoral thresholds where smaller parties, if they do not reach a certain quota in terms of voting, they do not get to be represented in Parliament. We do not have those formally in law. But however, because we have electoral districts that have different populations, and obviously this translates into different, what we call magnitudes, which means that in some electoral districts, we only elect 2 members in Parliament, and in other districts, we elect 46. So this generates a huge divide within the country. It is easier for political parties to get representation in these bigger the magnitude districts than in the shorter ones. In smaller electoral districts, the main political parties, the biggest parties, they get this seat bonus, I would say, because they end up winning more seats than their share of the vote would suggest. So we do have this. It is one of the things that actually explain why smaller parties face so many difficulties in getting elected in this smaller magnitude districts. So in terms of representation, you know, the history, Portugal has this traditionally had and historically had these 5 political parties that are elected through this proportional representation system. But the last decades have demonstrated that things can change. And that the Portuguese party system is also dynamic and has been able to, see the emergence of the left bloc, and then more recently the Liberal Initiative or the radical populist party Chega, that has been able to gain grounds even in these smaller electoral district. I mean, it's a dynamic game. Things are constantly changing, but one of the things that is more relevant, and I guess that Carlos demonstrates that, is how resilient the party system has, despite this, the newness, and also to some extent the attractiveness of these new political parties. Because citizens tend to be drawn towards new parties. The most interesting thing is that we were able to still keep the 2 main political parties as the main players in these games. But I mean, who knows how things can evolve from now.
Right. What has characterized the Portuguese economy for the past 2 decades? I mean, the first 2 decades of the 21st century. What would you say are the domains where it has fared well, and in which domains is it still lagging behind other European nations?
Well, the economy chapter was was written by Susana Peralta. She's one of the most well-known economists in Portugal. And she does an amazing job in this chapter where she demonstrates that over the past 2 decades, Portugal has made huge progress in reducing poverty and inequality. So what she demonstrates is that we do have noticeable improvements in these areas. She demonstrates that poverty rates have dropped, inequality was reduced. She demonstrates it, tracing it back to the importance of income transfers. So the policies that were specifically targeted at distributing health and improving the quality of life of citizens. What she also demonstrates was the capacity of Portugal to bounce back from the economic crisis. So we also managed, that we also covered a couple of minutes ago. She also demonstrates the relevance of taking stock of the European Union again, and the importance of the recovery and resilience plan, the funding from the European Union that has emerged as a golden opportunity to invest in critical areas, as the green energy, digital transformation, social resilience. So these are arenas that are falling behind. So if I was up to now talking about the things that are positive, one of the things that Susana demonstrates is there are areas where Portugal is lagging behind. One of them is obviously the levels of public investment. I mean, one of the things that she demonstrates was that public investment as a share of GDP is just 1%. So it's really, really low. And it has been this low since 2016. So what this means in practice is that things like transports, health, and the education system, it hasn't, these are arenas where they need a lot of investment, and these investments have not been made. So, and we've talked about it when we mentioned the welfare state. Another thing that she mentions is that while all the other countries are dealing with these digital green transformations, while we are lagging behind. One of the things that she demonstrates is that some of the countries are actually pouring money into the renewable energy, sustainable transportation. And in Portugal, the investment is really, really low in those arenas. So one of the things that she concludes is that, while we made huge progress in some arenas, there are areas that we still need to improve. And obviously, while at the beginning of the 21st century, Portugal's per capita was higher than some of the countries in Europe, like Slovakia, Estonia, and Slovenia. She talks about it. Almost 20 years after that, those countries have caught up or even surpassed Portugal. And one of the things that she mentions in the book is that, one of the reasons that explains this, the fact that we were surpassed by these countries, was that we have problems in terms of productivity, we do not invest enough in science and innovation. That's also what Joana Sad also demonstrates. And obviously, she also mentions that there's a lot of infrastructure that needs to be developed. So we are lagging behind in these arenas, and those are the ones that are putting us behind some of the countries across Europe.
So let's now talk a little bit more about attitudes that people have toward particular subjects. How would you characterize social attitudes toward women, immigrants, and minorities in Portugal? And particularly immigrants and minorities have been, at least it seems, a very polarizing topic socially in Portugal in recent times. So how would you characterize these kinds of social attitudes?
Well, this is a chapter that Alice Ramos wrote. It's an amazing chapter because it allows us to really map citizens' attitudes and how these citizens' attitudes have evolved. And not only citizens' attitudes, regarding these aspects that you mentioned, women, immigrants, etc. But what she demonstrates is how we do have a lot of inequalities in place at this moment. Let's start with women. Obviously, one of the things that she concludes is it's that, well, we are still facing the wage disparities. Portugal made huge advancements in terms of women representation in parliament, women representation in party lists. We made huge progress here, but women still earn less than than their male counterparts. So this, even as we deal with higher qualification professions, in the arenas where these higher qualifications are required, we do find that women, and what the list demonstrates is that women tend to win 25% less than men. So in terms of salaries, that's huge. That demonstrates a lot about how much we still need to work in terms of gender balance and in terms of equality here. And then there's the issue of immigrants. And the narrative here is quite complex here, because as you mentioned, this is one of the things that has fueled populist discourses. And so what she demonstrates is that perceptions have shifted. For example, the majority of population in 2002 thought that, the majority of citizens in Portugal still think that immigrants are a threat to the labor market. So this is something that she demonstrates. There has been a growing acceptance. So the number of citizens that believe in this has declined, but there is a high level of skepticism when you find that 40% of respondents still think that they are a threat to the labor market. That is a lot in terms of skepticism. So there are still citizens that think that immigrants benefit from social services more than they contribute, even though we have so many studies that demonstrate that how immigrants actually contribute to social security, etc. But the perception is that these immigrants, there is this negative attitudes towards immigrants because of the use of these social services. And also, Lise deals with how we also think about minorities, racial, ethnic groups. And the situation here, while we made some progress as well, is concerning because one of the things that she demonstrates is that a lot of citizens in Portugal think that some races are less intelligent. Some Portuguese think that some races are born to be more hardworking than others. So what she demonstrates is that are a lot of stereotypes that are still in place, and that to some extent, if the stereotypes to some extent legitimize the discrimination against these groups. So we did a huge progress in terms of becoming an inclusive society. And this links back to the welfare state and the relevance of the public investment. But there's also a lot of work that we still need to do in terms of changing the mentalities and attitudes that citizens have towards women, immigrants, and minorities, obviously.
So let me ask you now, what is the current state of science and academia in Portugal? Has Portugal been performing well in those domains?
Well, this is one of the issues that I was most curious about when we asked him, and when Nuno asked Joana Sá to write this chapter about science in Portugal. Obviously, me coming from academia, when I read the chapter, I recognized a lot of patterns that Joana mentioned in the chapter. Well, what she demonstrates is that we have this unbalance, I guess, because we have citizens that are engaged with science. you saw that probably with the COVID-19, how citizens actually thought that we actually need investment in science and how relevant this can be for society. So we do have citizens now more interested in medical science. So we do have this, citizens are interested in science museums. We have this, we made this way. But then what you demonstrate is that things are not just about public interest. What she says is that we have a group of citizens, of scientific workforce that is highly trained, that is capable of competing in the international stage. We are now entering the stage where we compete for funds in the European Union. We are able to position Portugal globally, but we are still, we face some challenges. One of them is, one of the things that she mentions is the idea that we still need to have a lot more transparency in the system. The fact that we need institutions, public institutions, to share data, so that only with data that is shared and transparent, we can ensure high public information and obviously deal with science. And this is something that resonates these days, is the issue of political instability. What she demonstrates is that science is one of the issues that is mostly affected by this political instability, because we have investment in scientific arenas that has been inconsistent. Political changes, when the party changes in government, are leading to instability, and that does not allow higher education institutions and research centers to prepare for long-term planning. So that's a huge problem in the Portuguese case. And another arena that we face is in terms of scientific publication. I mean, what she demonstrates is that, well, we have these capabilities, we have this capacity in terms of our universities to publish in international publications. We made a huge progress in this, also huge progress in terms of PhD students that are formed, but it's as if we reached the threshold. We still, while we made huge progress, we are now entering this, we are stabilizing, but at a lower level than other European countries. So they are still moving at a faster pace than as we know. So while Joanna demonstrates that we have a huge hope here, because we have citizens believing in science. I mean, they support science, but this is something, again, that can be fragile, the support and attitudes that citizens towards science. If you have elites mining some of these efforts that have been done, so the citizens' support towards science is also something that can change. So we still have a lot of progress to be made here. We still have a skilled scientific workforce, and we have higher education institutions that are able to compete internationally, globally, and that's huge from a country as small as Portugal, and with the problems in terms of public investment that we mentioned before. And then there's this political instability that if the impact of political instability in terms of competitiveness in science, in academia, and being able to program in the long term is definitely something that will negatively impact the progress in terms of science.
So among the many different kinds of indicators from a particular country that we can evaluate, we also have cultural indicators. So in that regard, I would like to ask you about the arts specifically. So when it comes to production and consumption of art in Portugal, what does the situation look like?
Well, we are now entering one of these chapters that I feel that I hope that I do a good job in translating what these authors have written, because I must assume that I am not an expert in all of these matters. However, the chapter is written for a wider audience, and my perception about this chapter is that, again, we have significant challenges in terms of production of arts and also in terms of consumption of arts. Well, first of all, the production of arts deals with the ever-present issue of the limited resources. There are the resources available for cultural institutions, for artists, are really low. Funding for the arts is really scarce, and it really reduces the capacity of these artistic movements to emerge and to be consistently supported through time. And this is also what Antonio Pinto Ribeiro also demonstrates, is that beyond the fact that we do not have enough resources for art, we also face this peripheral status that to some extent limits the capacity of the Portuguese artists to be able to be present in this global culture and to have access to international markets. So we would need additional support for the arts. The arts and the cultural arena is one of the arenas where we find lower investment in every state budget. And then there's consumption, right? So, let's not forget that most citizens in Portugal still face economic constraints, and obviously this limits citizens' ability to deal with and to take part in these cultural offerings. So what he demonstrates in this chapter is that, how families actually invest in culture is modest. And while we do have pockets of cultural activities that are vibrant across the country, we have local art exhibition, communities that celebrate their heritages, etc. He also demonstrates that there are certain demographics, especially the ones that are more constrained in terms of their economic situation, and that generates low levels of consumption and low participation rates. So again, we go back to the relevance of resources and investment in these areas to also encourage participation in these cultural arenas.
So something that might not be so obvious, do cultural factors like art consumption translate into political behavior?
Well, the short answer to that question is yes. Let's think about this historical backdrop, right? So when we had this revolution in 1974, we had this huge creativity and knowledge that was contained during the dictatorship. And so after 1974, we had artists exploring the themes of colonialism, immigration, social justice in music, in the arts. So this was in the filmmaking and theater groups. So what he demonstrates is that there is this huge connection between these two. And then this idea that when people engage with the arts, they are able to reflect the realities or challenge their perspective. So what obviously one of the things that comes out of this chapter is this idea that the arts can also be a way of political mobilization, but again, with the limited funding and low cultural consumption rates, this can limit the potential for for the arts to ensure this political mobilization. But I mean, and even now, you know that we have these movements about the colonialism, how we behaved, and how we have adapt towards these countries, and that is also connected to the artistic aspects and how we took stock of these of some of these arts of these countries. So the arts are and the political issue is often within the artistic movements.
So I noticed that we are close to reaching our time limit. So in the interest of time, let me just ask you one last question. There's this phenomenon of the Europeanization of Portugal. How has it been looking like, and in what areas has it occurred, and how?
Well, this is the chapter by Sandra Fernandes and Isabel Camisão. They deal with this idea of Europeanization. What they explain in the chapter is that we often think that the European Union is the huge commander, right? Like Portugal has to adjust its domestic policies to what comes from the European Union. And that's what they call Europeanization from top down. Like countries adopt what the European Union asks us to do. And that generates some sort of uniform, this Europeanization it's actually how countries are adjusting equally their policies and institutions to align to European Union standards. But one of the things that I find most interesting about their chapter is the fact that they do recognize that the country has gone through this process of Europeanization, but the country has also been able to set its pace, and has also been able to be involved and be a key player in the European Union. And what they demonstrate, this key role, is how politically Portugal can still, I mean, they talk about Portugal, but they could be talking about other countries, the way that countries can still have a voice within these institutions, and they can also help shape European Union policies. And then demonstrate that by talking about how Portugal was the country. It was a key player when the European Union consolidated the relationships between the European Union and Africa. This is basically a result of how the result of Portuguese diplomacy. That's what they demonstrate. They also talk about the Lisbon strategy, how Portugal was trying to demonstrate an agenda focused on innovation, knowledge-based, and this idea that it is possible for a small country also to set goals in terms of unemployment, etc. And then Portugal has a unique stand because it has this rich, huge history related to the seas. And that's why Portugal was so relevant in building this integrated maritime policy. And it was mostly because of the vision of José Manuel Durão Barroso when he was the president of the European Commission, that he was able to bridge and to bring the knowledge and the history that Portugal had in terms of ocean governance into the EU discussions about this ocean governance. So what I think is that while the European Union impacts every arena of our daily lives now, it's impossible to think about the majority of things that we do currently without the European Union. And that was a strategy that we decided to go through and to be part of the European club when we decided to democratize the country. But I think that what I found most interesting about their chapter is the way that Portugal is also able to have an impact in several key areas within the European Union. And so this Europeanization also has a little bit of a hand of Portugal's that is still it's trying to still have a relevant role within these institutions.
Great. So the book is again Portugal in the 21st Century. I'm leaving a link to it in the description of the interview. And Dr. Patrícia, apart from the book, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Well, the book is freely available. You can obviously citizens can buy the book if they wish. The book is available through FLAD, through the foundation, and it's also available by Routledge, the publisher that managed to publish the book. The book is open access. That's one of the things that the foundation allowed us. It's something unique also. The fact that while you obviously can buy the book and have the book physically, you can also access each of the chapters freely. And I just want to say that how much I appreciated having this conversation with you about the several chapters of the book, and that I hope that this last project of the late Nuno Monteiro actually reaches what he thought about, the idea that we would be able to think about Portugal and how unique the Portuguese experience has been through this new millennium.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you. Thank you. See you next time. Thank you.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingburg, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Fortiago, Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Tantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Zigoren, Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alni Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.